Some stories refuse to fade not because they are dramatic, but because they leave behind an uncomfortable silence. This was one of those moments. It happened late at night, far above the streets, where the city's noise thinned out and the world felt paused. There was no crowd, no anticipation, and no reason to expect anything memorable. Yet something unfolded that night that people would later struggle to put into words, not because it was violent or loud, but because it defied how moments like that are supposed to end. What unsettled those who heard about it later was not an action, but a shift in atmosphere that felt final without ever becoming visible. At the center of that night was Bruce Lee. And what made the story endure was not something he did, but the way the moment changed simply because he was there. People expected escalation, tension, or movement. What they encountered instead was a stillness so complete that it disrupted the natural flow of the situation itself. Most confrontations follow a pattern so familiar that people rarely question it. The atmosphere changes first. The air feels tighter. Awareness narrows. One small signal, eye contact, movement, tone sets everything in motion. Tension begins to rise, and emotions quietly step into control. Fear looks for safety. Ego looks for dominance. Aggression looks for release. These forces build on one another until silence becomes unbearable and something finally happens. Whether the outcome is victory, retreat, or chaos, the moment resolves itself through reaction. This pattern exists because human beings are conditioned to respond to pressure with emotion. When uncertainty appears, the mind rushes to fill the gap. When danger is perceived, the body prepares before clarity arrives. This automatic response gives confrontation its momentum. Once that momentum starts, it is difficult to stop. Each reaction feeds the next, pushing the situation forward whether either side fully understands it or not. That night should have followed the same path. All the ingredients were present. Tension was there. Expectation was there. The conditions were right for escalation. One person entered the situation prepared for resistance, already anticipating disorder and preparing to meet it. This preparation alone usually accelerates conflict. When someone arrives expecting chaos, they unconsciously create it through posture, tension, and readiness to react. But the other presence in that moment disrupted the sequence completely. Bruce Lee did not match the energy in front of him. He did not brace himself. He did not sharpen his stance. He did not prepare for an exchange or anticipate an outcome. His body remained relaxed, not careless, but settled. His posture did not communicate challenge or retreat. It communicated balance. His awareness was steady rather than alert in a defensive way. There was no signal to read, no emotion to interpret, and no intention to confront. This absence of signals broke the rhythm that confrontation depends on. Tension requires feedback to grow. Fear feeds on reaction. Aggression escalates when it meets resistance. Bruce Lee offered none of these. Instead of amplifying the tension, he absorbed it. Instead of responding to expectation, he remained present. This quiet absorption prevented the moment from gaining momentum. When escalation does not occur where it is expected, confusion replaces certainty. The mind searches for familiar cues and finds none. The situation loses direction. What should have been a sequence becomes a pause, and that pause changes everything. Bruce Lee's composure did not diffuse the situation through deliberate calming gestures or words. He did not attempt to control the moment externally. He controlled himself internally. That internal stability reshaped the environment without effort. The tension that was meant to rise had nowhere to go. It did not disappear dramatically. It simply failed to grow. This is what made the moment unusual. Conflict is not only about opposing forces. It is about shared participation in escalation. When one side refuses to participate emotionally, the structure of confrontation collapses. The expected push and pull never begins. The moment remains unfinished, suspended between what could happen and what no longer will. Bruce Lee understood this instinctively. He did not see confrontation as something to be rushed or avoided. He saw it as something to be entered with clarity. By remaining grounded, he removed the conditions that allow conflict to take shape. His presence communicated certainty without threat and confidence without aggression. This combination is rare, and it destabilizes situations that depend on emotional exchange. The person who arrived expecting resistance found none. Instead of disorder, they encountered calm. Instead of reaction, they encountered awareness. The preparation for chaos became unnecessary, then confusing, then irrelevant. The moment lost its direction because the expected opposition never appeared. What makes this significant is not that conflict was avoided, but that it dissolved before becoming real. Nothing dramatic interrupted it, nothing forceful ended it. The situation simply failed to become what it was supposed to be. That failure is what people later struggled to understand. They expected a story with action and resolution. Instead, there was a gap. A moment that should have turned into conflict but quietly did not. And moments like that linger, because they challenge assumptions about how power and confrontation actually work. This night revealed that escalation is not inevitable. It requires participation. When that participation is withdrawn through composure and alignment, the moment loses its ability to move forward. Bruce Lee did not stop the conflict by overpowering it. He stopped it by never giving it the conditions it needed to exist. That is why this moment stands apart. Not because something extraordinary happened, but because something ordinary failed to happen. And sometimes, that absence tells the deeper story. Human behavior is shaped by reaction. From an early age, people learn to respond quickly to what surprises them. A sudden sound causes the body to tense. An unexpected movement triggers alertness. A perceived threat brings fear or aggression to the surface. These reactions are automatic, and they help the mind make sense of what is happening by providing direction. Anger signals confrontation. Fear signals retreat. Movement signals escalation. Together, these cues allow situations to progress toward an outcome, even if that outcome is unclear. When these cues appear, the mind feels oriented. It knows what to prepare for. It knows what role to play. Reaction creates momentum, and momentum carries the moment forward. But that night, reaction never appeared. The absence of reaction changed everything. Bruce Lee remained completely still, not in a frozen or defensive way, but in a settled and deliberate one. His body did not tense. His posture did not sharpen. His expression did not shift to reveal fear, anger, or readiness to attack. There was no emotional signal that could be interpreted, and no physical movement that could be answered. This stillness offered nothing for the situation to build upon. When the mind encounters stillness where it expects reaction, it struggles. It searches for meaning and direction, scanning for cues that explain what will happen next. Normally, those cues arrive immediately. But in this case, they did not. The mind reached outward and found nothing to grasp. This created a psychological pause. In that pause, the situation lost its rhythm. Without reaction, there was no escalation. Without escalation, there was no clear next step. The moment hovered in uncertainty, suspended between expectation and reality. This suspension was not comfortable. It removed the familiar structure that confrontation depends on. Bruce Lee's stillness did not calm the situation by softening it. It disrupted it by removing its engine. Reaction is what drives momentum. Stillness starves it. There was no emotional opening to exploit. Fear often invites pressure. Anger often invites challenge. Aggression often invites resistance. But stillness invites none of these. It closes the loop before it can form. Without an opening, the situation cannot progress in its expected direction. This lack of progression creates imbalance. One side remains prepared for movement, while the other remains unmoved. The contrast becomes difficult to reconcile. The mind begins to question its assumptions. What was expected to be a dynamic exchange becomes static. What was expected to escalate becomes quiet. In this quiet, certainty dissolves. Certainty relies on prediction. Prediction relies on cues. When cues disappear, prediction fails. The mind becomes unsure not because of danger, but because of absence. It does not know whether to advance, retreat, or wait. That uncertainty weakens intention. Bruce Lee's stillness functioned as a kind of psychological mirror. It reflected the other person's internal state back at them. Any tension they carried became more noticeable in contrast. Any readiness they brought felt excessive when met with calm. This contrast intensified awareness of imbalance without any action being taken. The situation did not move forward because there was nothing to push against. Pressure requires resistance to become effective. Without resistance, pressure collapses inward. It loses purpose. It becomes wasted energy. This is why stillness was so disruptive. It did not oppose force. It made force unnecessary. It did not challenge aggression. it made aggression irrelevant. The expected exchange never occurred because one side refused to participate emotionally or physically. Importantly, this stillness was not passive. It was attentive. Bruce Lee was not disengaged from the moment. He was fully present within it. His awareness remained open, receptive, and grounded. This allowed him to remain stable without becoming rigid. That balance is difficult to confront because it offers no weakness to exploit. Most people mistake stillness for hesitation or fear. In this case, it was neither. It was control without display. And control without display is unsettling because it removes familiar reference points. As the pause stretched, the situation quietly unraveled. Not through force, not through resolution, but through loss of direction. The moment could not become what it was meant to be because its foundation reaction was missing. That is how stillness disrupted the situation completely. It did not end the moment loudly. It caused it to fade before it could fully exist. And moments that dissolve this way are often the hardest to explain, because nothing visible marks their conclusion. What remained afterward was not an event, but a realization. When reaction disappears, power shifts. And sometimes, the absence of action is the most decisive move of all. What people later struggled to describe was not fear in the usual sense, and not intimidation as it is commonly understood. There were no threats, no aggressive gestures, and no attempt to assert dominance. What unsettled those who reflected on the moment afterward was something harder to define, a shift in balance that happened quietly and decisively. One person entered the situation carrying internal tension. That tension may not have been visible at first, but it was present nonetheless. It showed itself through readiness to react, through expectation of disorder, and through the subtle mental noise that prepares for confrontation. This internal state naturally pulls attention outward and forward, anticipating what might happen next. It creates momentum even before anything unfolds. The other presence in that moment was entirely different. Bruce Lee did not arrive carrying that tension. He was not bracing for conflict or anticipating resistance. His internal state was quiet, steady, and aligned. There was no mental urgency, no emotional weight, and no need to prepare for outcomes. This difference in internal condition mattered far more than any physical position or visible action. Because Bruce Lee remained undisturbed internally, the space around him began to feel different, not through intimidation but through stabilization. Situations often take their shape from the emotional states within them. When tension is present on both sides, it multiplies. When tension is met with calm, it has nowhere to expand. Instead of escalating, the moment settled. This settling removed momentum. Momentum depends on participation. It requires both sides to contribute energy to the unfolding exchange. In this case, only one side carried that energy. Without reinforcement, it could not sustain itself. The encounter did not explode into action or resolve through confrontation. It simply lost direction. This is why the moment felt unresolved yet finished at the same time. There was no clear ending, no decisive action to point to, and no obvious conclusion. Yet the situation had clearly reached a stopping point. The potential for escalation had dissolved, not because it was suppressed, but because it was unsupported. When one person remains internally quiet while another carries noise, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Quietness sharpens awareness. Noise scatters it. The person who is aligned stays connected to what is actually happening. The person who is tense becomes consumed by what they expect to happen. Over time, this imbalance grows heavier. In that imbalance, awareness shifts. On one side, perception becomes clearer, small details stand out, timing feels natural. On the other side, attention collapses inward. Thoughts multiply. Certainty weakens. The mind begins to question itself. This internal collapse does not announce itself, but it changes behavior subtly and decisively. The outcome shifts without force, because force is no longer needed. Force exists to overcome resistance. When resistance dissolves internally on one side and becomes unsupported externally on the other, force becomes irrelevant. The situation resolves itself through imbalance alone. This is what made the night so difficult to explain afterward. People looked for action to justify the outcome, but there was none. They searched for intimidation, but it was absent. They expected dominance, but it never appeared. All that remained was the memory of a moment that changed direction without any visible cause. Moments like this challenge how people understand power. Power is often imagined as something applied, something visible, something forceful. This moment suggested something else entirely. It suggested that internal alignment can reshape external reality without effort. Bruce Lee did not attempt to control the situation. He did not attempt to overpower it. He simply remained exactly where he was, internally and externally. That constancy altered the balance of the moment so completely that continuation became unnecessary. What ended the encounter was not action, but absence. The absence of tension, the absence of reaction, the absence of internal noise. That absence removed the conditions required for conflict to exist. This is why those who heard about the night struggled to put it into words. There was nothing dramatic to describe, yet something definitive had happened. And experiences that end without explanation often stay in the mind longer than those that can be clearly understood. The change that night did not come from what Bruce Lee did. It came from what he did not bring into the moment. What made the moment so difficult to forget was that it ended without leaving a trace. There was no visible conclusion that people could point to and say, that is where it finished. No raised voices, no physical struggle, no clear turning point. Nothing outwardly dramatic marked the end. And yet, everyone involved sensed that the situation had reached a definite conclusion. Something had closed, even though nothing had visibly occurred. This contradiction created a strange aftertaste. Human beings are used to understanding events through action. We expect beginnings, climaxes, and endings. We expect cause and effect. When a moment resolves itself without following this structure, the mind feels unsettled. It knows something has happened, but it cannot explain how or why. That discomfort becomes memorable. Because there was no clear action to describe, the story could not be told in the usual way. It was not passed along as a detailed account of events. It moved quietly from person to person, as a feeling, an impression, a sense that something unusual had taken place. Each retelling lacked specifics, but carried the same emotional weight. That weight is what allowed the story to travel. Stories like this survive because they resist explanation. When people can clearly describe what happened, the story eventually settles into a fixed shape. Once it is understood, it loses its mystery. But when a story refuses to be pinned down, it stays alive. Each listener fills in the gaps differently, which keeps the story flexible and enduring. Another reason the story continued to spread is that it challenged assumptions. Most people believe power must announce itself. They expect it to be loud, forceful, and unmistakable. This moment suggested something else entirely. It hinted that power could exist without display, without aggression, and without action. That idea unsettles people because it contradicts what they have been taught to recognize as strength. People can easily describe actions because actions have form. They can be measured, timed, and analyzed. Presence does not work that way. Presence is felt rather than observed. It influences the atmosphere of a situation without leaving evidence behind. When someone encounters a level of presence they cannot categorize, it stays with them longer than something they can explain. That night lingered in memory because it altered perception rather than producing an event. It made people question what actually ended the situation. If there was no threat, no force, and no confrontation, then what caused the moment to stop? That question has no simple answer, and unanswered questions tend to remain active in the mind. Bruce Lee became central to the story not because of something he did, but because of the effect his presence had on the space itself. The environment seemed to reorganize around him. Tension faded. Momentum disappeared. What should have unfolded simply did not. That absence became the most striking detail. The story also spread because it revealed something personal to each listener. It forced people to consider moments in their own lives where situations changed without obvious cause. Most have experienced times when an argument ended suddenly, when tension dissolved without resolution, or when someone's calm shifted an entire room. This story gave language to those experiences, even if it could not explain them fully. The story became larger than the night itself. It stopped being about a specific place or moment and started representing a deeper idea about control, awareness, and power. Stories that touch something universal tend to survive longer because people recognize themselves in them. The lack of proof did not weaken the story. It strengthened it. Proof limits interpretation. Without proof, the story remained open, adaptable, and personal. Each person who heard it took away something slightly different, but the core feeling remained the same. Something ended without force. That is why the story continued to spread. Not because it was sensational, but because it was unresolved. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle. It lingered because it suggested that power does not always need to act to be effective. That night stayed alive in memory because it exposed a form of influence that operates quietly, without announcement. And once people sense that such power exists, they cannot easily forget it, even if they cannot explain it. What the rooftop ultimately revealed was a truth that most people overlook throughout their lives. Not every moment is resolved through force, confrontation, or decisive action. Many situations appear to demand movement, response, or escalation, but in reality, they are sustained only by participation. When participation is withdrawn at the internal level, the situation begins to lose its structure. That night demonstrated that control does not always come from doing more, but from needing to do less. When someone is fully composed and aligned within themselves, the external situation loses its leverage. Pressure depends on reaction to maintain its strength. Intention relies on opposition to remain relevant. Momentum needs resistance to continue moving forward. Remove these elements, and the moment begins to collapse quietly. There is no dramatic ending, no visible turning point, but a gradual weakening of the forces that once made escalation feel inevitable. This is what happened on the rooftop. The situation did not end because it was defeated. It ended because it was no longer supported. Bruce Lee did not attempt to overpower what was unfolding. He did not assert dominance, issue threats, or take control of the space through force. Instead, he remained entirely beyond the emotional reach of the moment. By staying centered and internally steady, he reduced the scale of the situation itself. What initially felt charged and volatile began to feel unnecessary and unsustainable. Moments grow large when they feed on attention, fear, and anticipation. When those elements are absent, moments shrink. They lose urgency. They lose direction. They lose the energy required to carry them forward. Bruce Lee's composure removed the fuel that escalation needs. Without resistance, there was nothing for pressure to push against. Without reaction, there was nothing for intention to act upon. This kind of control is subtle and often misunderstood. It does not look like authority in the conventional sense. It does not announce itself or demand recognition. It operates quietly, reshaping the environment without visible effort. Because it leaves no marks and produces no spectacle, it is often overlooked. Yet its effects are decisive. By remaining completely in control of himself, Bruce Lee made the moment smaller than it needed to be. He did not enlarge it with fear or shrink from it with avoidance. He allowed it to exist without interference. In doing so, he prevented it from becoming something greater than it was. The direction it was heading lost relevance, and the situation could no longer justify continuing. What the night revealed is that many conflicts persist, not because they are necessary, but because they are fueled. When the fuel is removed, conflict fades. This applies not only to confrontations, but to arguments, pressures, and internal struggles as well. When people stop feeding situations with emotional energy, those situations often resolve themselves. The rooftop became a quiet demonstration of this principle. It showed that strength does not always appear as action. Sometimes it appears as restraint. Sometimes the most powerful move is remaining exactly where you are, internally and externally, without being pulled into reaction. This truth challenges common ideas about power. Power is often imagined as something that pushes, commands, or overwhelms. That night suggested something different. That power can also be the ability to remain untouched by what tries to move you. When a person reaches that state, situations lose their ability to dictate outcomes. The moment did not end because it was confronted. It ended because it could not continue in the presence of complete composure. That is what the night actually revealed, not a hidden technique or dramatic act, but a deeper understanding of how control operates when it is rooted entirely within the self. And once that truth is seen, it becomes difficult to forget. What that night ultimately leaves behind is not a mystery to be solved, but a lesson to be recognized. It shows that the strongest influence in any moment does not always come from action, resistance, or forceful control. Sometimes it comes from a state so grounded that the situation loses its ability to grow. When a person is fully present and internally settled, events stop pulling them forward or pushing them back. The moment adjusts instead. Bruce Lee did not resolve the situation by confronting it. avoiding it, or overpowering it. He resolved it by refusing to let it define him internally. That refusal changed the scale of the moment. What seemed charged became unnecessary. What felt inevitable lost direction. The night ended not because something dramatic occurred, but because nothing more was required. This is why the story remains difficult to explain and impossible to forget. It points to a kind of strength that does not rely on display, noise, or reaction. A strength that exists quietly, but decisively, shaping outcomes without leaving evidence behind. Once you understand that this kind of power is possible, the way you look at pressure, conflict, and control begins to change. That night was not remembered for what happened on the rooftop. It was remembered for what no longer needed to happen after that.